F. Murray Abraham, and I believe that Joe Papp was the greatest producer of the 20th century. I don't mean just the last half of the 20th century. I'm talking about the whole century.
My name is Avi Hoffman, and welcome to Celebrating Yossel, Joe Papp at 100, and the lecture, The Miracle of Joe Papp by Miriam Hoffman. One of the greatest miracles the world has ever seen was a young Jewish child of immigrants who spoke no English. And yet he ended up miraculously changing the very essence of modern theater in America and the world. Joseph Papp was born Yossel Papirovsky in Brooklyn, New York, on June 22nd, 1921, the son of Yetta Mirich and Shmuel Papirovsky, Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe. When he was 6 years old, he got lost in the subway from Brooklyn to New York. The subway doors closed. His father remained in the subway while Yossel mistakenly stepped out onto the platform and got lost. People wanted to help, but as a child of immigrants, little Yossel could only speak in Yiddish. The police were called, but the boy was hysterical until his father showed up. This event was instrumental in the development of the man who envisioned and implemented free Shakespeare in Central Park, the New York Shakespeare Festival, and the Public Theater. In the words of Academy Award-winning actor F. Murray Abraham, who did Shakespeare for Joe in his youth, Joe Papp was the most important producer of the 20th century. Who was Joe Papp, and what drove him to change the world of theater as we know it? As a youngster who grew up in such grinding poverty in Brooklyn's Williamsburg section, he was overwhelmed by the realities of life that devoured most people's dreams. His father, an impoverished family man, descended from the city of Kielce in Poland, who worked himself to the bone making tin boxes. His mother was a seamstress in a sweatshop, and both of their hard work did not provide them with a decent living or enough food on the table. If that wasn't enough, they were hit with the Great Depression when Joe was about to hit his teenage years, and he felt obliged to help his parents out. When in later years Joe Papp would talk about his childhood, he did so in grim Dickensian terms. "I come from a sector of Judaism that was poor in every sense," he would say. "I always wondered how we got to Williamsburg. We were so isolated. There was no network among the Jews, no sense of being protected. My parents had no friends that I knew of and not many relations. The phone was in the corner candy store, so you always knew who got a call, and they never got a phone call. There was very little conversation at home, and almost nothing was said about the past." It would be 5 decades later when the Jewish Forward newspaper ran an article comparing him to his paternal grandfather that the producer first began to examine his family history. The Papirovskys came, as I said, from Kielce, Poland, notorious as one of the Eastern European cities to have had a pogrom after the Holocaust. Papp's paternal grandfather, Moshe Papirovsky, was a teacher. At 20, his son Shmuel Papirovsky escaped conscription into the army by making his way to America. When he arrived in New York City in 1913, he found work as a trunk maker. 4 years later, he married Yetta Mirich, whom he had met at Goldberg's Farm, a restaurant and dance hall in Brooklyn. The Williamsburg into which Joseph Papirovsky was born in 1921 was not the cohesive Hasidic enclave it would become after the Second World War. There were not even enough Jews to give the neighborhood the kind of security and numbers that ruled the Lower East Side, or Brownsville, Brooklyn, which was called the Jerusalem of America, because of its large number of synagogues. The family lived in a series of tenements, moving 4 times before Joe turned 12. All walk-ups located on the top floor, with 2 tiny bedrooms and a toilet in the hall. His mother and sisters slept in one bedroom, father and sons in the other. The kitchen served as the washroom, dining room, and living room. During the winters, when the only source of heat was a coal stove, the flat was cold. During the summers, so hot that Joe and his younger brother would drench themselves with citronella and brave the mosquitoes out on the fire escape. His father would rise at dawn to pray, and then he would start out to look for work. He didn't return home until after nightfall. Joe remembered falling asleep on the floor waiting for him. And when his father would return, he would lift young Joe up and lay him down on his bed. They were evicted from their apartment numerous times for not paying rent. But as soon as the marshal was gone, their neighbors, who were good people, would gather their belongings and put them back in their apartment until the next eviction. Joe recalled that his father, a warm-hearted and accommodating man, loved to sing. He used to take Joe along with him to the synagogue, and the men there used to dance around with the Torah. His father would say, "We must hold on fast to the Torah. In case it drops to the ground, God forbid." Joe loved to sing. He believed everything that he sang. And he also believed that singing was a man's direct communication with God. On the holidays, he sang, and he saw his father sitting in the front row. He was wearing his old tallis, his prayer shawl, the one he brought with him from Poland. His father loved to hear Joe sing because he seemed to have the idea that a man sang directly to God without any intermediaries. They were happy people, very happy. They loved to sing and dance. In spite of their financial straits, they were freilich, which means happy, joyous in Yiddish. Joe's father was well versed in his Jewishness, and Joe's mother came to America as an orphan from Lithuania. She was industrious, neat, and a terrific housekeeper. Day and night, overloaded with work, she never complained, kept everything to herself. The Yiddish language was their mamalosh, their mother tongue. By the time I was in junior high school, Joe said, I had beaten up and gotten beaten up by all kinds of people. But with all of them, no matter how hard you were hit, you never had a sense that it was meant personally, except for one young thug named Whitey. He was different. He was an Irish kid that was always after me, trying to shake me down because I was Jewish. Whitey was such a gangster that even the adults were afraid of him. Well, one day, Whitey punched me in the face so hard, he made my whole mouth bleed. I've always remembered the shock of it, what it did to me psychologically. But that was only the first part. The second was that my father was standing there and he could not help me. I felt so sad. I was so sorry for him. Whitey showed total brutality with no hesitation, no remorse. He provided my first encounter with quintessential violence, and what I would later connect to Nazism and fascism. I felt crushed by Whitey, and I saw my father was crushed too. He acted like a European Jew after a pogrom. He packed his bags. As a young man eager to escape poverty, Joe began selling fruit and vegetables from a pushcart and selling nuts in Brooklyn's botanical garden. He polished rich men's shoes. He was an errand boy, a cook, and even ran around with people's laundry to wash. His sole purpose was to defeat the poverty of his life as fast as possible. Now, most Jews knew that celebrities like Eddie Cantor, born Edward Israel Iskovich, and Jack Benny, born Benjamin Kubelski, were the sons of immigrant Jews. They had all seen the Al Jolson movie of the jazz singer. If they wished to make it in America, they needed to take the Jewish out of their intonations, their names, and their pasts, all of which Joe would do. It was not until March of 1942, when he and his younger brother were looking for work, that he first lied about being Jewish. They were being rejected for jobs, they thought, because they wrote Jewish on the employment forms. When they wrote Protestant on their applications, they both got the jobs. Like other Jewish men of his time, he began passing, not mentioning his Jewish identity, as a strategy to get a job. Later, it became a precaution against personal rejection, or a joke, or a game, just to see how much he could get away with. He said, "What I experienced most intensely was anti-Semitism. I always feel that it's just below the surface, skin deep. And if you scratch it, a lot of it will come out. I was more affected by the Holocaust than I was by poverty. I feel that I can't get comfortable, that I'm a Jew and my fortunes can change tomorrow." Joe fell in love when his high school teacher, Eulalie Spence, introduced him to Shakespeare. "You blocks, you stones, you worse than senseless things. Oh, you hard hearts, you cruel men of Rome." He was smitten. He couldn't admit to anybody that he loved Shakespeare because on his block, they would have beaten him up if they'd known. He joined the Navy, but Jews in the military thought twice before having H for Hebrew printed on their dog tags for fear of being captured by the Nazis. After his service, he went to Hollywood, but soon realized that theater was his passion. When longtime associate Bernard Gersten met him at the Actors Lab in Los Angeles, he said, "Joe never used a Yiddish expression and never responded to one. He never talked about his parents. I thought maybe they were dead. It was obvious to me that he was Polish, a hard-drinking, brash, fiery Gentile." Joe would not correct people who assumed that he was of Polish, Russian, or Greek extraction. After returning to New York, he was hired as a stage manager at CBS. A number of organizations had a policy in the 1950s of firing anyone who pleaded the Fifth Amendment before a legislative committee. Joe was caught up in the communist scare because of his youthful sympathy for the movement. And when he was called up before the committee, he refused to give names. He was fired by CBS for taking the Fifth before the House Un-American Activities Committee in a hearing about his political beliefs and associations. But supported by his union, Papp appealed the firing, and an arbitrator ordered him reinstated. He refused the job. He took his severance, and he pursued his dreams of creating theater for the people. He searched out a small stage in a neighborhood church on East 6th Street, in the midst of great poverty, among the poor minorities and other impoverished Jews. He paired up with a rare partner, none other than William Shakespeare himself, who became his driving force. Papp founded the New York Shakespeare Festival in 1954 with the aim of making Shakespeare's works accessible to the public. In 1957, he was granted the use of Central Park for free productions of Shakespeare's plays, following an enormous political battle with Robert Moses and the city of New York. Joe felt that it was absolutely essential to get people into the theater, to give them an experience with a living play and Shakespeare. He believed that in order to attract an audience that represented all groups, regardless of their ability to pay, including those that could pay, that even 25 cents would be too high a cost. He felt that since public libraries were free, a city the size of New York should have a public theater and free Shakespeare in Central Park. And so he battled the powerful New York City Parks Commissioner, Robert Moses, at City Hall, which opposed his ideas, and he won. He attracted young talent, suffered humiliation, but knew where he was headed and what it would take to get there. He fought with the city officials, organized protests and demonstrations, until he finally convinced the city bureaucracy to grant him the right to produce free Shakespeare in Central Park. David had beaten Goliath, and it was opening night. When he went out there in Central Park, the place was packed. Every seat was full. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen," and he couldn't get any further than that. A roar. A roar. You never heard such a sound in your life. And Joe just stood there and let it wash over him. The people felt it was their triumph. That with Joe Papp as their general, they had won the war. He was living in an age of passion and struggle. And he believed that to have something less on the stage than what happens in life was a cop-out. Controversy very often followed Joe. In 1962, when CBS TV announced that it would televise The Merchant of Venice live, the New York Board of Rabbis demanded cancellation of the program, calling the play a distortion and defamity of our people and our faith. Members of the Jewish war veterans picketed CBS executive offices, and the story was picked up by the national press. The rabbis took their case to the mayor. Once again, Papp was at the center of the controversy, especially since most of the players imagined that Joe was not Jewish and had no right to produce The Merchant of Venice, so filled with anti-Semitic venom. But as usual, Joe shocked the media by acknowledging his Jewish identity. As a Jew, Papp told the press, I have always considered Shylock representative of the thesis that all people are alike and suffer in the same way. But I have decided that we have reached a stage of maturity in race relations where there was no reason to ignore one of Shakespeare's best plays. He cast George C. Scott as Shylock. Thousands of theatergoers saw The Merchant of Venice live in Central Park, but the televised broadcast had an estimated audience of 2 million viewers, catapulting Joe and his mission into the national limelight. Like many great American inventors, he had started with nothing but a notion. Like the great American tycoons, he devoted his life to giving it form. The odds for his success were not good. Joseph Papp had no family money, no higher education. He had never attended college. no network of social or political contacts, the financial underpinning of government endowments and private foundations for the arts that came into existence during the 1960s was unavailable to him when he began. Nevertheless, Joseph Papp had influenced a huge number of his contemporaries and younger people in the arts. Hundreds of writers, actors, directors, composers, designers, producers, arts administrators, stage managers, journalists, and critics traced the beginnings of their careers to the festival. Thousands more dated their first exposure to Shakespeare to a production in Central Park. Millions of others had seen his productions on television and on Broadway. The name Joseph Papp became synonymous with Shakespeare and the highest level of creativity in the theater. With Joe's vision, New York itself became the mecca of theatrical creativity and innovation. He was constantly in search of new talent, among them playwrights, directors, actors, dramaturgs, and designers. He revolutionized the theatrical process by developing the concept of the workshop, which allowed the creative teams to slowly experiment without the pressure of an imminent opening night until the product was deemed ready for the public. And the hits kept coming. Hair, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, the musical version of Two Gentlemen of Verona, for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough, No Place to Be Somebody, which was the first off-Broadway play to win the Pulitzer Prize. And of course, Papp's groundbreaking production of Michael Bennett's Pulitzer Prize-winning musical, The Chorus Line. He produced the plays of David Rabe, Tom Babe, David Henry Hwang, and Jason Miller. His 1985 production of Larry Kramer's play, The Normal Heart, addressed in its time the prejudicial political system which was turning its back on the AIDS crisis and the gay community. Joe felt the theater was alive when it was attached to what was going on outside of it. And so it was always the interaction of these two that were of interest to him. Because of the revenues of such commercial hits as Hair, Two Gentlemen of Verona, and A Chorus Line, the New York Shakespeare Festival had become one of the largest arts institutions in the United States. At Lincoln Center, it became a constituent alongside the venerable New York Philharmonic and the Metropolitan Opera. The view of these old and long exclusive institutions of what constituted art and its interpreters was, with few exceptions, taken from the European model, as were their conventions, their programming, and the expectations of their audience. Those audiences included New York City's wealthiest inhabitants, as well as a large dollop of tourists, expense account business visitors, and suburbanites who patronized them, provided that they could park their cars in a protected lot. But the New York Shakespeare Festival and its audience was, by contrast, composed of men and women whose diversity was uncommon, not only in New York City, but anywhere else on the American cultural scene. The audience for Free Shakespeare was the only one in the world in which it was not inconceivable that a welfare recipient might be seated beside an investment banker, a Brooklyn native beside a Parisian tourist. Papp had anticipated multiculturalism by a few decades. Joseph Papp was a pioneer in a commitment to non-traditional casting, using a variety of ethnicities and colors of actors in his new plays and Shakespeare productions. The father of a gay son, Tony, Papp aligned himself with gay and lesbian concerns in at least two specific instances. He fought anti-obscenity provisions that Congress briefly imposed on the National Endowment for the Arts during the Reagan presidency. And he chose to produce The Normal Heart, which decried institutionalized homophobia, as well as Mayor Koch's response to the AIDS crisis. There are many wonderful books written about Joe and his illustrious career from the mainstream perspective. But I would like to share my personal perspective of Joe Papp from his lesser-known love and dedication to the Yiddish language and culture. My personal family's relationship with Joe began in 1985 when my mother, journalist and Columbia University professor of Yiddish language, Miriam Hoffman, interviewed him for her column in the Yiddish Forward newspaper. There was instant rapport. He fell in love with her Yiddish, she with his charisma. He invited her to work along with him as he prepared for his yearly benefit for the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York, which stores the largest collection of Yiddish archives in the world. My mother asked me to join her in developing the Yiddish materials for that program. It was the year Joe and the YIVO honored Neil Simon. And as usual, Joe Papp enlisted Broadway and Hollywood stars to these occasions, among them Jack Klugman and Tony Randall. During one dress rehearsal, Joe came in with a gift-wrapped box for Tony Randall's birthday. When Tony unwrapped the box, he found in it a Hanukkah dreidel with a card that read, "Roses are reddish, violets are bluish. If it weren't for Christmas, we'd all be Jewish." Tony burst into laughter. And that night, he and Jack Klugman sat on the floor playing dreidel. Joe invited us to his studio on the 6th floor of the Public Theater, and he asked us to read the Yiddish musical project that we had been developing, Songs of Paradise, and the Joseph Papp Yiddish Theater was born. Joe and Gail came to see our first production at the Riverdale Y in the Bronx. And on opening night, Joe was so impressed with the production that he walked on stage in front of the audience and announced that he was moving the show to the Public Theater. A month later, on January 19th, 1989, Joe Papp presented the first modern revolution in the century-old Yiddish theater, an all-original Yiddish-English hybrid production, which opened at the New York Shakespeare Festival. We were all delirious with joy. We celebrated our opening at Sammy's Romanian restaurant on the Bowery with chopped chicken livers and full containers of schmaltz, liquid goose fat. 12 midnight, Joe picked up the New York Times and read the review out loud. There is surely nothing now on stage in New York that is more sprightly in any of our city's many tongues than Songs of Paradise, the first production of the Joseph Papp Yiddish Theater. The entire English press raved and gave us glowing reviews. The show ran for 8 months, 8 performances a week to sold-out houses. Joe was there almost every night, embracing us with great enthusiasm, saying, "This is the best time of my life. When I hear the audience laugh and respond to the sound of Yiddish, I feel as if a warm wave washes over me." The Joseph Papp Yiddish Theater appeared at international Yiddish festivals all over Europe with great success. All the actors, except one, were children of Holocaust survivors. And that production became a testament to the survival of the Jewish people and Joe Papp's full embrace of his Jewish identity. He produced many Jewish-themed shows, including modern interpretations of Leivick's The Golem, and Ansky's The Dybbuk, and continued to seek groundbreaking expressions of Jewish culture until he passed away in 1991. He headed his empire for decades, but later in his life, the young child of immigrants, Yossele Papirofsky, poor little boy from Williamsburg, that little Yossele Papirofsky would awaken within him. He was overwhelmed with memories of his father's melodious tunes, his mother's quiet desperation, and the fight for social justice of his youth. He rose up for human rights for the abused and the neglected. Towards the end of his life, Joe Papp, surrounded by his numerous awards, would sit behind his elegant desk with tears in his eyes, reminiscing and bewailing his parents' lives. Mandy Patinkin, in an interview, said the following: "Years ago, Joe Papp called me up and asked me to do a song for a benefit for the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research at the Schubert Theater on Broadway. He said, 'You need to sing a Yiddish song.' And I said, 'I don't know any.' And he said, 'What? It's about time you learned one.' And so he sent over a song called Yossel Yossel. I loved Joe. He was like my father. He was the most important person in the world to me. He signed the ketubah at my wedding. And so Joe came over one night for Shabbos dinner, and I had recorded Yossel Yossel, which I played for him. And he looked at me and he said, 'You must learn this music. This is your job.' And I knew what he meant. He meant that for whatever reason, I had been given the privilege to sing, and that it was my turn to get in the long line of people who have been carrying on this Jewish tradition, a tradition that was almost decimated in World War II, and so many voices were silenced." Barry Edelstein served as a director of the New York Shakespeare Festival, the Public Theater's Shakespeare Lab Conservatory, and the Shakespeare Initiative. He said this of Joe: "In his later years, Joe became very, very Jewish. He started studying Talmud, brushing up on his Yiddish, and taking stock of his life. Every Jewish organization in the city was clamoring to honor him." The name Joseph Papp embodies the history of theater, the very best example of the American dream. When he died in the fall of 1991, he had survived several newspapers, 4 mayors, 6 city parks commissioners, and at least a dozen New York theater critics. But his institutions, including the Joseph Papp Yiddish Theater, live on. He revolutionized the theater industry as we know it, and his developmental workshop concept is now the industry norm. As a result, in large part to the Save the Theaters preservation effort led by Papp in the 1980s, the theater district remains one of New York City's primary and most popular tourist attractions and destinations today. In the year 2000, the Joseph Papp Children's Humanitarian Fund was founded. The fund serves as the humanitarian arm of International Children's Club Tzivos Hashem's activities in the Ukraine. Papp co-founded, along with Rabbi Mark Schneier, the foundation for ethnic understanding, to strengthen ties between the Black and the Jewish communities. On April 23rd, 1992, the Public Theater was renamed the Joseph Papp Public Theater. His biography, Joe Papp, An American Life, was written by journalist Helen Epstein and published in 1996. Yosale Papirovsky. Joe Papp's life was, always will be, a miracle, and his legacy lives on forever. Thank you.
Hello, it's Nathan Lane, and I'm here to say happy 100th birthday to the late, great, legendary Joseph Papp.
And Joe is alive, and we are blessed to have had him in our lives, and his memory lives on forever, and his life lives on forever, and his actions live on forever. He is our true inspiration. God bless you, Joe.
Happy birthday, Joe.
Happy birthday.